Continuing our discussion on data representation, we looked at different encoding and decoding techniques. Now, this brings us to the Huffman encoding. We will try to understand what is the Huffman encoding, how do we perform Huffman encoding, and how can we decode things that have been encoded using the Huffman encoding. So the Huffman encoding is built around the rationale is why should the characters X and Z take up the same number of bits as the characters E and space? Now, if you notice, X and Z sometimes occur less frequently than E, R, and space, I, and some other characters. So the motivation here is that why should characters that occur less frequently in the text have the same number of bits in their representation than characters that occur less frequently? That's the rationale. So the Huffman encoding uses what we call a variable length encoding. And the variable length encoding assigns different lengths of codes to different characters based on their frequency. So the more frequently used characters here are, the shorter strings they would use to represent them. So have a look at this Huffman encoding. So we've got different characters, A, E, L, O, R, B, and D, and the variable length part of it, with the Huffman code on the first column, shows different lengths of code that have been assigned to different characters. So for example, A is coded with 00, which is of length 2, and D is encoded with 1011, which is of length 4. So this Huffman code has made the assumption that A occurs more frequently than D. So because D occurs less frequently than A and E and L, it is assigned a larger length. So because it occurs less frequently, the larger length Huffman code will be used much less than the code, say, A, E, L, and so on. So have a look at the Huffman encoding in the blue box on the right hand side of the screen. So we have the word ball board, and we can encode it using this Huffman encoding. So using this table, we first have to encode our B. All right, so the B is coded as 1010, so 1010. Then we have to code the A. Okay, so the A is encoded as 00, so here we encode it with 00. Then we have an L, which is encoded by 100, and we do this twice because it's LL, so 100, 100. Then we have to encode a B again, and if you remember from before, the B is 1010. Then we have to encode an O, which is 110. All right, there it is. Then we have to encode an A, and if you remember, A's are 00. Then we have to encode a R, which is 3 ones, which is this. And finally, we have a D, and the D is encoded as 1011, which encodes together. All of these form the word ball board. Now, we can also decode from a Huffman encoding. So if we're given a Huffman encoding such as this one, we can also decode it. So what we'll do is we'll look at the first character. It's a 1. We search for 1, a code which a character with the code of 1, and it doesn't have any. So we then look at 1 1, and there's nothing. Then we look at 1 1 1. So this gives us our R. Okay, so we can scratch these 3 out and then start the same process again. So 1, nope, there isn't any. 1 1, there isn't any. 1 1 0, there is. There's an O. 1 1 0. So we can then put the next letter as O and scratch this out. And we can continue in this way. If we do, we will find out that the word is roadbed. So this is how we can encode and decode if we already have a Huffman encoding table. So if we have the Huffman code assigned to a character, we can easily encode and decode. So the Huffman encoding makes use of a very special property, and this is how it's able to encode things successfully. The Huffman encoding has a prefix property. So the prefix property is built into the Huffman code, and all it means is that no Huffman code is a prefix of any other Huffman code. For example, this code is not a prefix of any other Huffman code. This code is not a prefix of any of the others. This code is not a prefix. Prefix in this case being the first few characters. So for example, 100, there's no other code here that starts with a 100, if we can put it that way. There's no other code here that starts with a 111. There's no other code here that starts with a 00. You see, you can see there are codes that start with a 10. There are codes that start with a 11. There is codes that start with 01, but no code starts with a 00, and so on. So no Huffman code is a prefix of any other Huffman code. That's the prefix property. So to decode, as we've said before, we look for a match from left to right, bit by bit. We do this algorithmically, right? So if we're writing a program to decode, we have to start with the length of 1, look at the table, there isn't, and look at the length of 2. We can move a sliding window, increasing and decreasing, as we move from left to right, to see if any code or subset of a code matches anything in the table. We then record the letter when a match is found, and then we begin where you left off, going from left to right, as we've done in this example road bed. So you can try it out in this example. So you can pause the video here and try to decode this code 101111001010. And if you do it successfully, you should get this word drab using this Huffman table. So there is a technique for determining that your Huffman code has the prefix property. So we'll look at that technique on the next slide, but before we do that, we first need to understand what types of Huffman codes can we get. Okay, well, there are just two types. There's the type of Huffman code that encodes letters, right? These are the ones that we've seen here. So it encodes characters. So here's English letters. Well, it could be Russian letters, it could be Mandarin letters, or whatever the case might be. But the fact is that there are characters that are being encoded. On the other hand, you can actually just encode words. So the word the occurs more frequently than the word xylophone, say, unless it's a textbook on xylophones, who knows. But you can actually just assign specific Huffman codes to words. So obviously my comment about xylophones and the word the has brought up the question, how do we determine which letters occur more frequently or which letters occur less frequently? And to do that, we would have to assign probabilities of how frequent they occur in a specific text to determine how frequently they occur for that specific text. So for example, you would look at the number of times R. If you're looking at letters, you'll look at the number of times the letter R occurs in a specific text, and you put it over the number of letters there are in the text, and that'll tell us about the relative probability of R being in the text, or being the next letter to appear in the text. And you can do the same thing with specific words. So if you have a textbook full of words, you can assign Huffman codes for that. Now, I'll leave you to think about the advantages and disadvantages of doing this with either words or characters. So let's look at the technique for, as I said before, the technique for determining codes that guarantee that it has the prefix property. So let's look at that technique. So before we look at it, let's paint a particular picture. So consider a data stream where there are only 4 characters. So there's the characters A, B, C, and D. All right, so there's only 4 characters. And they occur with these respective frequencies. So A occurs 40% of the time, B occurs 35% of the time, C occurs 20% of the time, and D occurs 5% of the time. So we're given these frequencies as probabilities, right? So we know this is a probability because, well, each one is between 0 and 1, and when you add them up, you get 1. Okay, so 0.4 plus 3. So 0.4 plus 0.35 plus 0.2 plus 0.05 give you 1. Now, before we look at the Huffman code, well, a type of coding that you could use here is you could have just used a keyword encoding, right? You could have assigned each one of these a specific code, a fixed length encoding, if this was a fixed length. So just ignore the variable length encoding that we will speak about as the Huffman code, but just assume you are going to encode each one with a fixed length encoding. So we can assign A then 0, 0, we can assign B a 0, 1, we can assign C a 1, 0, and we can assign D a 1, 1. Okay, so that if we're not using a variable length encoding, then if we have 4 things, then on average we can assign a 2-bit string to each of them. If we had 5 things, then you can't assign a 2-bit string, you would need a 3-bit string. So if we had 5 things, A, B, C, D, and E, then A would be assigned 0, 0, 0, B would be assigned 0, 0, 1, C would be assigned 0, 1, 0, and D will be assigned 0, 1, 1, and E will be assigned 1, 0, 0. So that was if we were doing 5 things, we would need 3 bits. And this brings us to the previous lecture. So, then on average we'll be using 3 bits. In this case, since there's 4 objects, we are using on average 2 bits. All right, this is it looks like it's not so important now, but it is important if we're going to be working out a compression ratio, which we will have to do for our Huffman code. So what I would like you to take away from this bullet point is that on average, to encode 4 things using a keyword encoding, we would need 2 bits. So what we would then do is we would arrange our characters vertically, from most frequent to least frequent, right? So let's do that. So A occurs with 40% of the time, so it goes right on top. The second most frequent occurring letter is B, which occurs 0.35. With frequency 0.35, then C with frequency 0.20, and D with frequency 0.05. Okay, if C occurred with frequency 0.4, then it would occur before B. Okay, so we would have to then just rearrange the letters. But it so happened that A, B, C, D occurred with frequencies from highest to lowest as it appeared here. Then what do you do? Okay, well, then we're going back to the technique. Well, all we would need to do is draw a binary tree. So you draw a binary tree by first connecting the bottom 2 letters or words, and then you connect the next 2, keeping the last 2 as an item. So there you would do that. So these 2 are together, and then this connects to that. Then you would have A, which then connects to the bottom set. So can you see this was a set which connects to B, which now becomes a set when connecting to A. And this is what we call a binary tree. So a binary tree, we've got a binary tree because each of these intersections goes 2 ways, okay? We can also call it a binary graph. So it's the same thing. So what we can do now, so what we can do now, okay, looks like I can't change the color. But, okay, so that's basically what we do with that. I'm just going to erase it, right? So that's how we get this blue line. And then what do we do? Well, we then start labeling so we start from this side, right? We then start labeling from here. So we make this a 0, and we make this a 1. Okay, there's the 0 and here's the 1. Then this 1 becomes the first bit in the next set, and then you do the same thing again. You write a 0 and you write a 1. Okay, and now we're trying to go back into this side, so we are going to make the next prefix 1, 1, and then we do the same thing again, 0, 1. And if you do that, you will end up with this binary graph. These numbers at the bottom indicate the frequency distribution as it basically decomposes. So we start off with a probability of 1, and then we end up with 40 on this side and 60 on this side. So 0.4 plus 0.6 gives you 1. All right, and this 0.6 decomposes as 0.35 and 0.25, and then that decomposes as 0.2 and 0.05. Okay, so this is not as important, but these are. So these binary strings are, because that's what gives us our Huffman code. Okay, so where is the Huffman code? Well, the Huffman code are these things. So A's code will now be 0, B's code will be 10, C's code will be 110, and D's code will be 111. And we will see here that it does maintain the prefix property, because we've made sure that this 0 never was a prefix of anything else. We made sure this 10 was never a prefix of anything else, because we just took this as the prefix, which is assigned to any code. And this is the reason why it follows the prefix property, because we designed it not to reuse a code as a prefix. So, right, so this is how you get your code. So A is the code 0, B is the code 10, C is the code 110, and D is the code 111. Okay, so we now need to calculate the compression ratio. So before we do that, we first need to calculate how much of bits do we use here on average. For this particular Huffman code, how much do we use on average? So we see that A is the length of 1, B is the length of 2, C is the length of 3, and D is the length of 3. So all we got to do is multiply the length of each of these. Okay, we sum them up. We multiply the length of each of these by the probability with which they occur. So 0, as we know from the previous slide, right? This here assigned to A occurs now 40% of the time. 10 will occur because it's assigned to B 0.35% of the time. 110 will occur 0.2% of the time. With probability 0.2. 111 will occur with probability 0.05. So all we do is we sum and we multiply. So we say, well, A, which is of length 1, occurs with 0.4%, with probability 0.4. And we add that to B, which occurs, which has the length of 2 and occurs 0.35. Then we add that to C, which has the length of 3 and occurs with probability 0.2. And then finally, we add that to 3 multiplied by D, which occurs with the string length with probability 0.05. Okay, so we combine these two together because they both occur with 3 bits, but with a length of 3 bits. But we can actually, you can actually use the distributive property here, and you can actually write it as 3 multiplied by 0.20 plus 3 multiplied by 0.05. Okay, just in case this is confusing you, but it shouldn't. Okay, so that's how you get the average number of characters used each time you use the Huffman encoding. All right, so that's pretty interesting. And on average, like I'll just say that again, on average we use 1.85 characters using the Huffman code. And before we said on average, if we use a keyword encoding, we could get on average 2. All right, so we already see some computational savings here. We see that if you were just to assign the characters 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, and 1, 1 to these different letters, then you would be losing out, because on average here you'd be using 2 bits, but on average here we are using 1.85 bits, which is less. So we have if you remember how to complete your compression ratio from the previous lecture, when we did run length encoding, you should remember that it's the compressed over the original. All right, so the compressed here is this the compressed, so that's going to be 1.85. That's the compressed with Huffman, and the original would have been, if we had to use a keyword encoding, which is on average we use 2 bits, so it would be 1.85 divided by 2, and that would give us the compression ratio. Okay, so that's this number over here. So this is how you calculate the compression ratio. And information theory, which is the study of how information is processed and stored, they set the theoretical limit of a compression ratio as 1.21. So as long as your compression ratio is less than that, then it's okay. Obviously, there are some issues with this, but we can just use this as a guide for now. All right, so that's all for Huffman. Well, that's not really all for Huffman. We'll speak about it again when we talk about the MP3s, but we'll talk about it very briefly. So let's talk about representing audio information. So what does it mean to represent audio information? Well, what does it mean? What does audio information actually mean? So how is audio or sound perceived? So we perceive sound when a series of air compressions vibrates a membrane in our ear. You might already know this. And this now, the vibration of this membrane sends a signal to the brain, which is interpreted in the brain as sound. And based on how much the vibration occurred, how much the vibration occurred in the membrane of the ear due to the air compressions, we then have different kinds of modulations, different kinds of frequencies, different kinds of sounds. All right. So a stereo, which is your CD player, sends an electrical signal to the speaker of the stereo, and that produces a sound. Well, the signal that it sends is an analog representation of a sound wave. That means the voltage fluctuates towards the speaker, and that is what gives us different kinds of sounds, different kinds of sounds. So the fluctuation of that voltage. So the voltage in the signal varies in direct proportion to the sound wave. So the kind of sound that you get, it depends on the voltage that gets received. So that's how the sound is produced from the stereo. Let's look at how we can actually represent audio information from the real world. So from the real world, we can digitize sound that we hear by sampling. And what does that mean? Well, we periodically measure the voltage that we perceive in the air and record the numeric value that it gives us in terms of the frequency. Well, that brings the question, how often should we sample, right? Should we sample 3 every second, or 4 every second, or 1,000 every second? Well, to get a reasonable sound reproduction, turns out you should sample at least 40,000 samples per second. Okay, so that's quite a lot, and that gives us our sampling rate. So here's an example. So this is our sound, okay, the audio information that goes through the air. And what we do is when we record it, we can't obviously record everything because it's continuous, but what we can record is every other one, as we spoke about in the last lecture. So we record every other sample, and that sampling in this way, we do lose information. So you can see we are losing information because, for example, this peak is lost, these things between here are lost, there's another peak that's lost. But if we do this, like we say, 40,000 times per second, then we don't really notice that the information lost. And that's important, right? Because if we don't notice the information lost, then why should we keep it? Okay, because remember, as computer scientists, our goal here is to capitalize on time and space, right? So how much of time it takes to run our programs and how much of space it takes to store information by our program. So you think about that, right? That has to do with complexity analysis, which you would learn a bit later on in data structures. But as a scientist, you always should be thinking, how can I speed up things by throwing away things that are useless? So in this case, if our brains can't tell the difference between 40,000 samples and 50,000 samples per second, then why should we keep that extra 10,000 samples? It's just an extra 10,000 space wasted in our computer. Okay, so that's something to think about, something that will play a much larger role in your second semester. All right, so let's talk about CDs. Well, what are CDs? CDs store audio information digitally, you notice already, and it does this on the surface of the CD. There are microscopic pits that represent binary digits. All right, a laser is then pointed at the disk, and the laser reflects light strongly if the surface on the CD is smooth and poorly if the surface on the CD is pitted. So let's look at this visually. Here's your laser, here's the receptor. It shoots a beam of light, okay? So it's smooth here, so it reflects with the same intensity back. But if there's a pit, then the receptor will notice it'll notice that a lower frequency of the laser is being received based on what was given, and so it'll therefore be able to recognize the pit. So this is an example of how we can store information, and these pits represent the numbers 0 or 1. As I told you, everything is stored digitally. So if the receptor detects a drop in the laser beam, it knows that it's either 0 or 1, and if it sees and this is how it's able to recognize it. So obviously we can all pits can be zeros, or all smooth areas can be ones, or vice versa. It doesn't really matter. So there are different audio formats that we use. There's WAV, there's AU, there's AIFF, there's MP3. Well, MP3 seems to be the most common one that people know about. So let's just spend a minute talking about that. So MP3 is a dominant audio format, okay, and it's I'm going to ask you whether this is lossy or lossless in a second, but just it analyzes the frequency spread and discards information that can't be heard by humans. Okay, so it looks at the magnitude spectrum, and it looks at what can we perceive, what actually can be interpreted by our brain, and what can't be, and if it can't be, it throws that part of the magnitude spectrum away. So is that an example of lossy or lossless compression? Right? It's getting rid of things. We don't really notice it, but it is getting rid of things. So if you look at the definition of lossy and lossless, you'll have your answer. On the other hand, the remaining bit stream that's left, what it decides to keep, it's compressed using a Huffman encoding to achieve an additional compression. So then that can be a separate question. What kind of compression is being used there? Okay, is Huffman a lossy or lossless compression or encoding? What is it? All right, so something to think about, because in that case you might have an argument looking at both of these comments, and you might end up saying that MP3 is either lossless or lossy. Okay, that brings us to representing images and graphics. So how do we represent color? Well, how do we perceive color, right? So the perception of the frequencies of light that reach our eyes is what we perceive as color. Okay, so that is the frequencies of light that reach our retinas. Okay, and our retinas have color photoreceptor cone cells that are receptive to the colors red, green, and blue. So it recognizes that. Okay, so that's how we perceive color. We have these different cells, these red cells, green cells, and blue cells. These are specialized for picking up those colors. So the way we represent color in a computer is quite similar. It's well analogous in some way, but it's expressed in the same way using red, green, and blue. But these are now given as intensities. Okay, so these three numbers are given different intensities, and based on the intensity set of each of these colors, we achieve all of the other colors that we recognize. So, for example, here is a set. R is indicated by this intensity. Green is indicated by this intensity, RG, and B, which is blue, is indicated by this intensity. So it's RGB. Okay, there's your B. And the colors here are it's remember we use 8 bits each, so you can have from 0 to 255 because that's 256 things altogether, and so you can represent 256 different intensities from 0 up to 255 for each of these different colors. So in this particular one, it's full brightness red, it's full brightness green, okay, and there's no blue. So if you have full brightness red and green, and if you minimize blue, which is making it 0, then we get the color yellow. All right. So this here codes for the color yellow. If this was 255 and 0, 0, then what color would be coding for? It will be red. If this was 0, if this was 255, if this was 0, then we'll be coding for the color green. And so if this is 0, if this is 0, and this was 255, we'll be coding for the color blue. Well, what happens if this is 100, 100, and 100? Okay, so in that case, okay, think about that. But before I help you with that one, let's look at if these are intensities, what would happen if we had 0, 0, and 0? Okay, that means there's no intensity of the colors, and so we'll have black. If we had 255, 255, 255, then that's equal and the maximum intensity of every color, which gives us white. So 100, 100, 100 will then give us some kind of gray that's in between black and white. All right, so something to think about. Obviously, I'm not expecting you to memorize all of the color combinations. You can imagine there's many different colors that we can represent with this. But it's important to know a few basic ones, and I can show it to you different ways. There is this, okay, the one way is by using this three-dimensional color space. Okay, I don't necessarily like this one. A lot of students like to use it. Personally, I like to show you a different way to remember this. Let me find a pen. So another way you can remember this is, if this confuses you, you can just remember this little saying, RGB, and you can make up some, I don't know, some saying with it. You can say Russian girls are beautiful, and then yet make me crazy. You can think of something a bit more smarter. I'm sorry. Okay, so, and if you do that, then you can say, okay, well, if you have equal quantities of red and green, you get some kind of yellow. So if it's 255, 255, and 0, then it codes for yellow. If you have 255 of red and 255 of blue, you get magenta. And if you have 255 of green and 255 of blue and 0 of R, you get cyan, right? So here's the different colors. Here's cyan, here's magenta, and here's and so on. So if you have equal combinations or whatever, you can work it out from here. All right, so for example, if you've got yellow and cyan, you mix them together, you get green. You got yellow and magenta, you mix them together, you get red, and so you can get blue with magenta and cyan. But this is basically the color triangle, and this is how we can generate different colors. So these ones are called the primary colors. That's R, G, and B, and Y, M, C is the secondary colors, which is yellow, magenta, and cyan. Okay, so here's a table with some of them. Okay, so here's black. Okay, there's no intensities. White, full intensities. There's yellow, there's pink, brown, purple, maroon. Now, it would be unfair for me to ask you to identify colors like this. It is difficult, obviously, to picture that. Our brains aren't really wired to mix colors like this in our heads. We're not really great artists, so maybe some of us are. But what you can rather do, what I will ask you are the combinations of the 255s, and obviously I might ask you gray as well, but these in-betweeners these are just, so it's possible, but I won't ask you what color is this. Okay, great. All right, so that brings us this index color. So an index color is a limited palette of colors which you can imagine. So why would we want to limit the number of colors that we get? So this has to do with space, right? And sometimes we don't really need that many colors for our purposes. For example, in a browser, we don't need all of the colors of the rainbow because we might only be coloring a pane or two. So it might not be necessary. And it might just slow down the program to have access to these large groups of colors. Or we might never use them, so it's a waste of space to keep it. So browsers in particular have an index color, which is just a specific palette of colors, which can be used for its purpose. All right. So the color model that I showed you before here, representing colors using this three-dimensional color space, this is one color model. There are other color models, right? This color model in front of us here is called the HSI model. HSI stands for hue, saturation, and intensity, and it's a representation using two cones. So you can see the two cones. The one cone is at the top, and the other cone is at the bottom. And here we have these three things: hue, saturation, and intensity. So hue is the color, saturation is how much of that color, and the intensity is between black and white. So you can have different intensities, hues, and saturation, and this will correspond to different colors. And you can represent more colors or less colors depending on the color model that you have. All right, so that's enough about colors in particular. Let's talk about digitized images and graphics. So let's first talk about digitizing a picture. So how can we represent pictures? So we look around the world with our eyes and we see there's so many wonderful things that we like to describe. How can we actually describe these wonderful things? And one of the ways of doing it is by these dots called pixels. So we can represent images as using these things called pixels. And these pixels are little color dots that, when put together, give us an image. These little color dots. So the resolution refers to the number of these color dots, these pixels. How many of them are used to express a particular picture, right? So the number of pixels used to represent an image is known as the resolution, and we get two kinds of ways of expressing beautiful pictures. We have raster graphics, which store information on a pixel by pixel basis. These are what we usually call images. And we get vector graphics, which store information using mathematical functions and geometric expressions, which we usually refer to as graphics. So let's first talk about raster graphics. Well, as I said, it's the storage of data on a pixel by pixel basis. All right, so examples of these are, well, bitmap. We have GIFs, we have JPEG, we have PNGs. These are all examples of raster graphics formats. These use pixels. It's their representation of images on a pixel by pixel basis. So there's different formats of these raster graphics. There's the bitmap format. And in bitmap, we have the pixel color values of the image from left to right and from top to bottom. So like a grid. This is called the bitmap format. We represent it as a grid, as a matrix. The GIF format, so this indexes a selection of colors. So in GIF, we only have 256 colors that can be used to. So you might have seen GIF formats before. I'm not too sure if you have, but in those images, you don't see much detail. You only see little blobs in some colors, and it's usually for, you have a meme, or you have on WhatsApp, you have those as well. You can send something, just a small expression. It's not meant to be beautiful. It's just meant to convey a particular message. Then we get JPEG. Well, JPEG I like to read up about, and PNG, which is like GIF, but we have a greater compression and a wider range of color depths. So when we spoke about digitization of an image, right, and we spoke about bitmap, we have these rows and columns that represent pixels, and on average we can get a quantized value which give us the average for that particular one. Now, what you're looking at in this slide is known as a grayscale image. A grayscale image means there is no color values. If you want to be technical, I guess the black and white are colors, but in this case there are no greens and blues and yellows and magentas and cyans and so on. and reds. So this is just between, it's just a color intensity between 0 and 255, 0 representing black and 255 representing white. Okay, so bright or dark. And each of these, so you can imagine how can we so before, when we were representing color images, we looked at these colors, right? So we have red, green, and blue. We have the vector, all right, a vector. So it's a tree-valued vector. But do you think that is necessary for this image? Do you think it is necessary to have a tree-valued vector per pixel for this particular image? No. Well, I hope you said no, because it's not, since there is no colors. We would only have a single value in each of these pixels. So these pixels will be between 0 and 255. 0 being dark, black, and 255 being white. So we can use 1 byte for each of these squares. But if it was a color image, we would need 3 bytes. Okay, 1 byte for red, 1 byte for green, and 1 byte for blue. That brings us to vector graphics. So we spoke about raster graphics. Now let's talk about vector graphics. So vector graphics is a format that describes an image in terms of lines and geometric shapes. So we have a mathematical expression of an image. The vector graphic is a series of commands that describe the line's direction, the thickness of the line, the color of the line, how does the line twirl around, or what is the functions associated with that, and the geometric expressions. And because we're using a mathematical explanation of the image, we often take less space because we don't have to store the entire the entire set of pixels, but rather all we're doing is we're just storing a small expression. But obviously, depending on how complicated the image is, we would need more explanations, which could also bloat up the size of the graphic. So now I'll leave you to think about, we can think about it together, but what is the usefulness of vector graphics and raster graphics? When is it better to have a vector graphic than a raster graphic? Or when is it better to have a raster graphic than a vector graphic? So let's look at the good side and the bad side. So vector graphics can be resized mathematically, and changes can be calculated dynamically as needed. All right, so if you want to zoom in, you just multiply, okay, because you're multiplying a mathematical expression or geometric expression, right? So you just multiply in. So can you think of why vector graphics are not good for representing real world images? And it has to do with the detail in the image. So I'd like you to look at this example over here. In this example, we have on the left hand side, let me put my cursor over it. On this side, we have a vector image, and on this side, we've got a raster image. Now recall when I said if we zoom in on a vector image, we'll just be reshaping the mathematical and geographic expressions, right? So look at this, it's perfectly neat as a logo. What's happening on the other side? Okay, so on this side, the vector image, you can still see it's as crisp as ever because we have mathematical and geometric expressions describing this image. So to zoom in, we can zoom in as much as we want. We will never lose the quality of the image. Okay, so this is the vector graphic. Let's go on this side and look at the raster image. What happened when we zoomed in? Okay, well, we zoomed in and we can now see the pixels are starting to what we call pixelate. They are becoming more and more blurry. So this is the raster image. We can see the decreasing quality. On the other hand, on the vector image, we can zoom in as much as we want and it will never decrease in quality because it's explained using mathematical expressions rather than on a pixel to pixel basis. Okay, so let's now talk about representing video. So video codec stands for compressor and decompressor. So methods, so we all know how videos work, right? A video is just a collection of images. You put a whole lot of images next to each other and you get a video. But what we'll talk about on this particular slide is the methods used to shrink the size of a video, of a movie, to allow it to be played on a computer or over a network. Because you can, as you can imagine, I don't know if you collect images on your personal computer, but you can imagine how big the file sizes actually get when you've got images on your computer. And can you imagine what a video must look like if we've got so many images put together to make a video? How much of these are actually going to be shown on your how much of these extra pictures are we going to store? So this is the problem. So we need ways of reducing the size of our videos so that we can actually store them on our computers, our personal computers. They don't take too much of space. So almost all video codecs use lossy compressions to minimize the huge amounts of data associated with the video. And we can't help this because if we have to reconstruct the video with every single image, you can imagine the time and the space that it'll require. So the first kind of video compression we get is called temporal compression. So temporal compression is a technique based on differences between consecutive frames. And the rationale is if most of the image in 2 frames hasn't changed, why should we waste space to duplicate all of the similar information? All right, so to help you visualize what's going on here, I invite you to look at this picture of temporal compression. So here we've got an example. Suppose you've got these video frames. So you got frame 1, you got frame 2, and you got frame 3. So remember, what did we say temporal compression was? It's based on consecutive frames. If most of an image in 2 frames hasn't changed, why should we waste space duplicating all of them? So what has changed between this image and this image? Okay, so this is the same, this is the same, all right? This is the only thing that moved. So this black box moved from the corner to this section over here. So we will store the keyframe as the first frame. And the consecutive frame, being frame 2, we're only going to store the difference. So everything else was the same in frame 1. The only difference is that this block moved over here. So that's the only thing that we're going to change. So it's like a subtraction, if you will, between frame 1 and frame 2. And then we can do this in 2 ways. We can have every consecutive frame as the keyframe, but what's often done is the keyframe is the first frame or a first frame in a window of frames, and that is subtracted from consecutive frames. So frame 3 in this case is exactly the same as frame 1. So if you subtract frame 1 from frame 3 or frame 3 from frame 1, you'll get an empty box. And so this is what is stored, and from this we can achieve the original. All right, so that's temporal compression. The other kind of compression we get is called spatial compression. And in spatial compression, this is a technique based on removing redundant information within a frame. And the rationale here is this problem is essentially the same as that faced when compressing still images. So we want to remove the redundant information. So let's look at what redundant information do we have. Okay, so here's an example of spatial compression. So we see frame 1, frame 2, and frame 3 have objects, but around the objects it's just white spaces. So why do we need to store those blocks? Okay, it's a waste of space. These are redundant information, and so we can just remove them. We remove the redundant information from our compression, and we end up with just the actual objects in the frames and nothing else. So this is an example of spatial compression. So these are the 2 compressions. So this is the end of the data representation part of this course. Please take the time to understand what's going on here. It's quite interesting, and I invite you to do some more research beyond the textbook, beyond the lecture slides, beyond these lectures. On what's going on here and what are some of the interesting ways to perform data representation. Perhaps you can open up some discussions in the Moodle forum for this particular topic, and to try to invoke some interesting contributions from students, because this is remember, we're working in a different kind of sphere now, where we are watching videos, you're listening to my voice most of the time, and you are taking notes, you're reading the textbook, you're watching slides, but the big social aspect of university is missing. Interacting with friends, interacting in tutorials. I know there's the consultations, but it's not the same thing. So, it might make sense to also set up some study groups maybe you can pair up with your friends and do some FaceTime to actually discuss some of these things, share some of the things you've learned or researched about spatial compression or temporal compression. This is to improve your own general understanding of these things. And to try to help you encourage, this kind of discourse, I invite you to use the forums on Moodle.